Welcome to another episode of the MEGIN Spotlight series. Today we are delighted to have Sherrie Van Oss as our guest. Sherrie is a mother of a 16 and a 14-year-old who both have achieved seizure freedom following epilepsy drug adjustments utilizing a combination of methods and tools including MEG. Hi Sherrie.
Hello, how are you?
Good, thank you. And you?
Good.
So can you tell us a bit about your epilepsy journey? At what age were they diagnosed and what type of epilepsy do they have?
My family's epilepsy journey started when my daughter was 8 years old. She was playing soccer and she was standing on the field and her coach had thrown a jersey at her and she just didn't respond. And they weren't quite sure what was going on. So they kept trying to get her attention. She just wasn't responding. And luckily enough, we have a good friend of ours who's an oncologist who works at a pediatric hospital here in Atlanta. And she knew right away what was going on. She was having an absence seizure. This is what we thought was the first time she had had it, but there was an incident at school a few weeks prior that we didn't know about it until it was too late. But she had apparently fallen off the chair and just looked like she passed out. They thought she was playing, but looking back, the teachers felt bad because they realized that she wasn't playing. She probably had a seizure at that point in time. So luckily, because she recognized what was going on, I was able to get up there. I was there in less than 10 minutes. She had called the ED for us, let them know that we were coming. So by the time we got there, we were able to get in very quickly. She had a CT scan and there was nothing on the scan, obviously, because there was nothing there. So because my biggest fear at the time when I was working in neuroimaging was that it was a brain tumor, because sometimes seizures are indicative of brain tumors. So that was my biggest fear. But because of who we knew at the time, she happened to know a pediatric neurologist who's one of the best in town. We were able to get in quickly. We were able to get her EEG done quickly. We were able to get her MRI done quickly. But unfortunately, the day of her EEG, because she had to be sleep deprived, she had another seizure. And this time it was a full-blown seizure, one where she actually fell in the shower. So it was a little scary. She was put on a medication that she did okay. She had about 2 small breakthrough seizures, but they weren't major. And then from about the end of 2015 until this year, she was essentially seizure free. However, she was still having EEGs every once in a while. So we did an EEG, I believe, at 3 years. And she was still having seizure activity. So even though she wasn't showing the signs of it, she was still having abnormal activity. My son is a little bit of a different story. He was diagnosed at age 15. Well, he noticed that he started having these little tics. They were all in his upper body and they were very minor, just thought, it was just him flinching or, it wasn't anything major. But it was the day after a cross country meet. He'd come home. It was an early cross country meet. He didn't get a lot of sleep. And then he woke up and it was about 6 o'clock at night. And he thought it was 6 o'clock in the morning. And we're like, no, it's still dinner time. So he walked into the closet because he just wanted to get something to eat and he fell. And I thought that was odd. I'm like, oh, did I leave something? Did he slip on something? Is there water in the closet? So I got him up. I asked him if he's okay. And he said, I'm fine. I'm fine. So then my husband handed him something. He started walking down the stairs. And he fell again. And this time he fell down the stairs. And he was having these convulsions just in his upper body. And then it stopped for a couple seconds. And I could tell he was pretty scared. My son's a pretty tough kid. And he was scared. Brought him upstairs, sat on the couch, started again. This all happened in a matter of 2 minutes. And it was just his upper body. He was completely awake for it. I grabbed his arms and I could feel every muscle twitching in his arms. And I looked at my husband. I said, he's having a seizure. We're going to the ED. So that's what ended up happening. We were very lucky. We had a great physician who came in. Unfortunately, it was still post-COVID. So there was, it was still a lot of waiting time and being separated. But when I described the seizure to the doctor, she looked at me and she goes, it looks like you know a thing or two about epilepsy. And I said, well, I have another kid with epilepsy. So they opted not to give him a CT scan, which I appreciate because of the radiation. So we ended up just going to see my daughter's physician. He had an EEG quickly thereafter, had an MRI. Sure enough, abnormal activity. He was put on the same medication as my daughter, and a couple months went by, and it really didn't do a whole lot. So we kept going up and up and up, and finally we added a second medication. Then they were talking about adding a third medication, and by then I was done. It's clearly it's not working.
So how did you end up selecting an epilepsy care team then for your children, since you knew a little bit about this already?
So initially, the care team that we selected that was local was because of a referral. And living where I live, we don't have access to non-invasive technologies. We don't have access to anything except for stereo EEG. And working in the business and knowing a thing or two about MEG, was able to get to know some of the folks and some of the specialists around the country. And there was one hospital in particular that I was particularly fond of. I thought very highly of. I knew they had a new system there. I knew the physician, and I ended up reaching out to him, and we were able to get in fairly quickly. And my children were able to finally get into the EMU unit to have a full scan and a full workup done, which is what they needed. So I knew they were going to have a MEG scan. I knew they had a TMS scan. They had a TMS, I think it's a scan done. And I knew the team. I knew Ritzpa, who happened to work there, and I knew Jim Wheelis, who's phenomenal. He's the most amazing doctor we've ever met. And Terry Willard, runs the TMS MEGS unit. They were just so great to work with that I couldn't see my kids going anywhere else. So that's why I ended up choosing Le Bonheur to go to. And that's how we ended up finally getting to the point we are today.
So over the years, what were your children's epilepsy care plans? When did the plan start involving anti-epileptic medications that you've mentioned already?
So when my daughter was initially diagnosed at 8, she was immediately started on medication. And when she was titrated to a normal dose, she had been seizure-free for years. However, she only received, I believe, 2 EEGs over the course of 7 years, which is a little concerning because here she was still having seizures and we didn't know it. With my son, it was a little different. And it seemed like they were almost a little more proactive because here we now have 2 children with epilepsy. And he had multiple EEGs. He had a 3-day EEG. He's actually had, I believe, 2 in the last year, in the last 6 months, at home EEGs. So he was treated a little bit differently, but initially started on the same medication. So I think the way that the care plans had started was, well, let's just go here because it worked for one, it's got to work for the other. But yet they presented with 2 totally different symptoms. My daughter had absence seizures, and then she ended up having a grand mal seizure earlier this year. She was actually supposed to be in the pool 20 minutes later because we were on our way to swim practice. My son presented a little differently. They were all upper body, completely awake, usually when he was sleep deprived. And we didn't need a doctor to tell us that it was juvenile myoclonic seizures. We kind of figured it out on our own. But it was just, they treated him differently, which it was a little hard for me to swallow just because, they both weren't doing well, but we actually didn't know how well they weren't doing until we did get the full workup done.
And the medication that you were prescribed, I mean, obviously you tried out more than one. When did you think you needed to sort of consult someone at Le Bonheur really about this?
Well, my daughter had been on the same medication the whole time. And when she had her grand mal seizure this year, we thought, okay, we just need to go up on the medication, but she's never had one that big. My son was having seizures, started in the summer. They started getting worse. He started having absence seizures. They added a second medication, wasn't working. The day before Thanksgiving, he had a full grand mal seizure, and he was already on 2 medications, so we knew it wasn't working. And what was hard is getting hold of a doctor on a Wednesday afternoon, the day before Thanksgiving. So we finally did. We were able to get a hold of somebody. And so we just went up on the medication. They just said, go up for now, come in next week. But he was just having a hard time with it. He's a really smart kid. He was having a hard time in school. He was sleeping all the time, and he was still having the absence. Like, so he started checking out like my daughter did, because his friends would tell him. They said, Brady, are you there? Are you there? And so by then they wanted to add a third medication. And that's when I said I kind of had enough. And I knew enough that two medications, okay, three, it's time. It's time to do something else, because clearly it's not working, and there's something else going on, and they're not on the right medication. And I needed somebody with the expertise who does this day in and day out and has the tools and resources to figure out what's going on.
So how did you find a place who could conduct an MEG scan? I mean, what was the experience of having an MEG scan like for your children?
So I knew a little bit about MEG from when my daughter was first diagnosed. Called a friend who used to work for a company that did laser ablation surgeries, and he had given me a couple of facility names, and I thought, okay. But then she was doing okay, so I thought, you know what, we're just going to wait. And this is when I was working for a neuroimaging company, and I happened to be at a conference, met the folks from Electa at the time, and actually got to see what an MEG looked like, met the rep. And then lo and behold, a couple of years later, I got a phone call from a recruiter, and it was for a job with MEGIN. So I actually felt very lucky to work there, because I thought, what a better place to be. It's something I'm so passionate about. I want to be able to work in this space. I mean, it's not only helps my kids, it helps so many other kids. And so it was a big passion of mine, and it was an honor of mine to work there. So when I decided where to go, I had known about Le Bonheur, because one of the systems that we installed while I was working for MEGIN happened to be at Le Bonheur. So that's how I got to know the folks there really well. And I got to appreciate what they do, how many patients they see a year, and their level of expertise. And I just couldn't get that in my hometown. And ironically, my own physician, my kid's physician, actually sends patients to Le Bonheur because of the fact that we don't have the technology here in Atlanta. So when my children had to go through it, it was actually kind of a funny story. My son had already been switched to a new medication before he had his MEG scan. And it's ironic that this medication was actually working, because when he was in the EMU unit, he was having 10 to 12 seizures a day that we didn't know about. So when he switched them to the medication, then they took him down to have the MEG scan, and there was nothing. And they kind of joked around that they almost dosed him too early. They wish they would have waited, because now there was no seizure activity now that he was on this new medication. So it was kind of comical, kind of not, but I was grateful. My daughter, on the other hand, had not been switched to her new meds. And when we went down, we actually were able to see 2 seizures happening while she was in the MEG scan. So she was quite comfortable with it. Both of them thought it was nice, calm, relaxing. I've had it done myself. It's very cooling, and it's a nice, calm experience. And we were able to actually capture the seizures. They weren't focal, so I was grateful that they weren't surgical candidates, because the last thing I want to do is put my kids through surgery. But I just needed to know. I wanted to know as a parent, is it focal? Is the EEG enough? And is the absence of anything on an MRI enough? And I didn't think it was. So I just felt like it needed to happen. They needed to have the expertise and the full workup that you just don't have access to based upon where you live. So we packed up our cars and drove to Memphis.
And how did the data then from each of your children's MEG scan inform that decision-making process? So, how did it differ for each child? I think we've discussed it a little bit, but, obviously going through a MEG scan adjusted your sort of following process with the medication.
So the one good thing that came out of my son's MEG scan is the fact that the second he was switched over to the medication, we realized that it was working, and he didn't have any seizures, whereas he was having up to 12 a day, which we had no idea. And then my daughter had not been switched. So we actually put them on two different medications. My son was going away for the summer. He had gotten into the Georgia governor's honors program. So he went to college for a month. We were so proud of him. He was one of 600 recipients in the state to get it. He didn't want to go through the 4 month titration process in order to get to the levels that he needed to be, because it was the drug he wanted to go on would have taken that long. And being away at college by himself, he didn't want to have to do that. So we switched him to a new medication. He was able to titrate pretty quickly. He was at the right dose by the time he went off to school, and he's been doing fine since. He actually just had an EEG 2 weeks ago, and there was nothing. So that's good.
That's amazing.
My daughter took a little bit longer because of the medication she was on. We just finished the 4 month titration process. So now she's stable. She's completely off her other meds. She's on her new meds. She hasn't had an EEG, and she's still seizure free. However, we still need to get the EEG to see what's going on. And we're actually heading back to Memphis in 2 weeks to have our 6 month follow-up with Dr. Wheelis. So he may order another EEG at some point. So we'll see if it's working, but I have a pretty good feeling that it is. It's just, it's amazing. Some medications work for some people, but it's finding the right meds and having physicians who are experienced enough to know which ones work best for which kid. So
really this was more of a process really for you than to almost have confirmation that you're doing the right thing with the medication and the right amount, or the right, the correct medication in this case as well for each individual almost. So then you obviously staying in touch with a team of clinicians at the moment, and you keep going back for confirmation, etc. So what advice would you give people that are in your situation? Not everyone is obviously able to have all the knowledge that you had prior to making the decision of getting a MEG scan. So what advice would you give at this stage?
I've talked to a lot of parents over the years who've had kids with epilepsy. I've talked to some advocacy groups. And I would tell any parent, or if they know somebody that has epilepsy, reach out to somebody. There's local chapters, there's state chapters. The American Epilepsy Society is a great resource. You can go to their website and find just about anybody. You can get involved as a volunteer, or you can get into a support group. It's always good to talk to other parents because you're not going through this alone. And that's the hard part, is that a lot of people don't know what to do. They get on the internet, they start Googling everything, and it can be overwhelming because there's a lot of information on the internet and some of it's not so great. But I would talk to other parents and hear what they're going through, because sometimes people learn from parents about what they do. For us, what I shared with folks is, we had Alexa who told us when to take meds. And then my husband's phone would go off twice a day. I heard the Notre Dame fight song twice a day because that was our reminder to take meds. But I would tell any parent to do as much homework as you can with the societies, join a group. And then for your kids, have them get involved. There's groups for them as well. There's camps, there's all kinds of resources for them. But I think being around other kids that have epilepsy, I think is helpful for them, because it makes them feel like they're not different. It's just a condition. It's like getting headaches. It's just a part of life. It's not, there's nothing wrong with you as a human. People go on to live very normal, happy lives, successful lives. But, it's just understanding that take your meds, and, there are other people that are going through this that are like me. And, my daughter did that. She loved it. She got to go to a support group with me, and I was grateful. She was grateful. She got to meet a lot of great kids. My son's a little older, and he was just diagnosed a year ago, so we haven't done that with him, but he's taking it in stride. He's the kid wants to be an engineer, and he said, I want to create something that is going to make all this worth it. So I want to do something that's going to help somebody, and who knows what that's going to be yet. We have a couple ideas, but we'll see where that ends up going.
Yeah, it's good to hear that this doesn't stop anyone from doing what they want to do. So I think that's a great message as well.
Yeah, kids should understand that they should not stop doing anything. And I do want to add this. I've got a son who's brilliant. He plays golf, he runs cross country. My daughter's on the swim team. She gosh, she used to play soccer. She was playing soccer at the time. She's played volleyball. She's extremely active. They're both on the skeet shooting team for the high school. So it's a rifle team. So the two of them are now on the same team because they're both in high school together. But we don't limit what they can do. The only thing that they were told that they can't do is jump out of airplanes and go uh, scuba diving. So that's it.
That's not too restrictive then, is it? That's not
Nope,
too bad.
I'm good with that.
Yeah, jumping out of planes, I'm not sure about that one anyway.
Me neither.
Well, we've come to the end of our segment today. So thank you, Sherrie, for your time. It's been really informative for our audience, and it's an honor for us to be able to share insights into MEGIN, the perspective of a parent and a caregiver to children with epilepsy. So thank you again for sharing your story with us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.